You're doing well. We're continuing our walk through the book of 2 Samuel, and because of the lockdown, this is a video for those of you who can't make it out to Care Group and are not able to Zoom. We hope you're studying the book. There's a commentary that will be on the website along with questions, and so hopefully you're following along, you're studying the book with us. These are important things, fascinating sections of Scripture, and so we hope you're keeping up with us and enjoying the study. I'm going to walk you through 2 Samuel chapter 9. If you remember, we've already covered David's ascension to the throne now in 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 5. 2 Samuel chapter 6, David now takes the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem, and that is the establishment of his position over the city, but also his position under Yahweh, who is the true king of the city, right? So we have this picture now that David has painted. All this has taken place up to that point, and then God makes the Davidic covenant with this man, with David, and this covenant essentially is a covenant that promises a future ruler, and it's connected with David because of who he is, but also because of who God is and what he plans to do in the future. And then we looked in chapter 8, and what we saw was that as David was obedient, God gave him victory over his enemies, and David's expansion of his territory begins to grow, and he begins to fulfill the Abrahamic Covenant. Why? Because he's keeping the Mosaic law. He's obeying God's commands to Moses. And so as he obeys, then the nation is blessed, and the Abrahamic Covenant blessings start to flood into the nation. Chapter 9 really is the same type of story, even though it just deals with one person. So instead of military conquest now, we have this story about one young man named Mephibosheth. This is a son of Jonathan who was lame in his feet. And we heard this story back in chapter 4, verse 4, where we hear about this young man, Mephibosheth, and when there's news that Saul and Jonathan have died, his nurse picks him up and starts to run with him. She drops him, and he's lame in both his feet. Now, this story in chapter 9 is really a story not necessarily about Mephibosheth or any of those things. It's not actually a type of Christ and us. Some commentators have said that. It's not those things. This story is a picture of David's obedience to the Mosaic law. David is keeping a vow that he has made to Jonathan. And you remember the vow back in 1 Samuel, David makes a vow to Jonathan. Jonathan knows that he's the prince. He has the rightful heir to he is the rightful heir to the throne. David is going to be the king, and Jonathan knows that. And so Jonathan says, listen, when you come into the kingdom, when you become the king, when you take power, I need you to remember my line. Now, a lot of people say Jonathan probably knew that he had to die in order to be taken out of the way. And so his death, though not by his own choice, should not have been a surprise to him. He understood that. And he essentially says, David, remember my family, remember my progeny when you take power, when you become the king. Now, that vow, David agrees. He makes that vow, and he says, I will not take away my loving kindness, my hesed, my covenant loyalty from your family. And so when David starts in chapter 9, verse 1, he says, David said, is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? That word kindness is hesed in Hebrew. It's the same idea, this covenant loyalty. David, in his heart, knows that he's made a vow to Jonathan to take care of his family. And he says, I have to show kindness to someone in Jonathan's family if I'm going to keep my vow. Now, why is this important? It's not just because David and Jonathan were friends. It's because David, for him to be righteous, he has to maintain the vow that he has made. If he violates the vow, he's not righteous anymore. And so David must do this in order to be righteous. He must do it. And it's also in his heart. He loves his friend Jonathan. He makes the vow intentionally, right? He loves his friend. He wants to care for his family. And so David's heart is behind this thing, but he also must do it. And he chooses to do it because he is a righteous king. That's the whole point of this story, is to show that David is a righteous king. And so that's what he does. And he doesn't even know where Jonathan's children are. He has no idea. Verse 2, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. Now, David has no idea where to look. So what does he do? He calls one of Saul's servants, really probably Saul's highest servant, and he says, Ziba, please come and help me find the progeny of Jonathan. Now, what's interesting here is the way that the author uses different terms for David. Notice in verse 1, he says, David said, is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul? And then it says, there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. So far we're just talking about David individually. And then it says what? And the king said to him, are you Ziba? And then verse 3, the king said, is there not yet anyone left? Verse 4, so the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, then verse 5, then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar, And then notice verse 6. And David said, Mephibosheth. What's going on here? Well, there's this interaction between Mephibosheth, David, and Ziba. When David is fulfilling his vow, he's functioning as David. When David is calling Ziba to himself, when David's telling Ziba what to do, he's functioning as the king. He's functioning as the authority, with the authority of the kingship. But when he's fulfilling the vow made to his friend Jonathan, when he's dealing with his own heart issues, the author calls him David. What the author's showing is that David is still a man of righteousness, and as a king, he is using that to fulfill the things that are righteous from his past. He wants to do what's right in every aspect of his life. That's the whole point of this text. David is a righteous king who's doing what is right in the sight of God. And so in verse 3, king says, essentially the exact same question to Ziba. He says, is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness to the kindness of God? Again, the kindness of God. The hesed that God has shown me, I want to show to somebody else. I want to have covenant faithfulness to them. Okay? Ziba said, there's still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both his feet. So Ziba informs him of Mephibosheth's that he's still alive, that he's still there. Verse 4, so the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he's in the house of Machir, in the son of Amiel, in Lodabar. This area is right by Mahanaim, right by where Ishbosheth, Mephibosheth's uncle, was the king. And he's there in that region. King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Amiel, from Lodabar. He calls him to himself. Now, this is very interesting. You have the King David now mixing together. The king has the right to call Mephibosheth to himself. But it's not just the king, but now it's the King David, his own heart. His heart is going out as he's giving this command to Mephibosheth to come. And that's what's taking place here. Now, Mephibosheth, rightfully so, is terrified. Why? Well, he's the son of Jonathan. Jonathan, though David and Jonathan were friends, David is now the king, right? And so Jonathan was the rightful heir, and now actually Mephibosheth is the rightful heir to the throne. He's the last remaining person in the house of Saul who has the right to take the throne. He's a dangerous guy in some senses for David, and so he's scared when he gets this news. He needs to come to the palace. And in verse 6, it says, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. Now, again, very interesting. They give his lineage there, right? Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and prostrated himself and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he said, here is your servant. Now, we're going to get to this. Very interesting. What's the reversal of fortunes here? David, who is a man after God's own heart, has now become the king, and Mephibosheth, who was the grandson of the king, has now become the servant. Before it was like this, right? Saul was the king, David was the servant, and now God has completely reversed those things. So that now David is the king, and the son and the grandson of Saul and the son of Jonathan is the servant. You have this total reversal of these two things. In verse 7, David said to him, do not fear. Of course, he's terrified. And he says, do not fear. I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan. Will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat regularly at my table. Now, what David offers him is an amazing blessing. He says, because of Jonathan, I'm going to show kindness to you. I'm going to show hesed to you because of Jonathan. I have a vow with Jonathan. I need to be faithful to that vow. Plus, I loved him. He was my friend, and so I'm going to show kindness to you. I'm going to bless you with all the land of your father Saul. Now, this is interesting. He had an obligation to give all that land to Mephibosheth, because all of that land was his rightful inheritance according to the law of Moses. And so what David does in giving all the land back to Mephibosheth is actually obey God in doing so. And then what he says is, not only that, but I'm going to bring you into my house, and you're going to eat at my table as though you were my son. Now again, total reversal of fortunes. Remember, Saul brought David into his house to eat at his table, and now David is bringing Saul's grandson into his house. The fortunes are exactly reversed. Mephibosheth is the recipient of mercy, where David was previously the recipient of mercy. All of this is reversing the fortunes and showing that David, now as king, is acting in righteousness. That's exactly what's taking place. And what does Mephibosheth do? Verse 8, he prostrated himself and said, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? And you think, man, this guy has very, very, very bad views of himself. And the reality is not that, right? The reason why he calls himself a dead dog is because what he's actually saying, he's actually quoting David. David says the exact same thing to Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 21. He says, Why are you coming after me? I'm a dead dog, just to flee. And now again, the fortunes are reversed, right? Mephibosheth is the lower one, and David is the higher one, where before David was the lower one, Mephibosheth was the highest one. So what all of this is showing is that while the fortunes have been reversed, David has responded in hesed, in covenant loyalty, covenant faithfulness, covenant kindness. He is doing what's right for Mephibosheth and for Jonathan and for really the house of Saul. Everything that he's doing is righteous. And why is that so important? Well, because it shows why God is blessing him. Now again, what happens? He turns and he says, and it says the king called Saul's servant Ziba. So now again, we have the reversal, the return back to the term king. Right? No longer David, no longer fulfillment of the vow to Mephibosheth, but now he's going to take that vow and he's going to exercise it as king. As a king, he's going to carry out that will. It says the king called him and said, all that belonged to Saul and all his house, I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him. You shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. What's he saying? He's saying, I'm going to give him all those lands. You're going to do all that work, and all the profit's going to go to him. He's going to be the one who's blessed by this. And to show what a massive gift this is, at the end of the verse, it says, now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Yeah, it's 36 people who are working this land. It's a big plot of land. It's a big farm. All that money is going to be coming to Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth's just sitting in the palace, enjoying the best of the food of the whole nation, as though he were a son of the king. Ziba said to the king, whether he likes it or not, we're going to find out later that he didn't like it, but he says to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Now, why is that so important? Well, again, we have this reversal of fortunes, but now David has fulfilled his vow. Verse 12, he had a young son named Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. He lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. 3 times we have this repeated. He ate at the king's table regularly, he ate at the king's table regularly, he ate at the king's table regularly. Why? To show David's kindness to him. It doesn't stop. It continues forever. And it says he was lame in both his feet. Why does the author end there? Because he draws our attention to this reality. It has nothing to do with Mephibosheth. It is David fulfilling his vow to God and to Jonathan. He is a righteous king. It's not about Mephibosheth. He's not worried about him as king. He's none of those things. He wants to bless him for the sake of the vow that he made to God and to Jonathan. And so David is a righteous king, and that's what's being shown. Now again, what do we know? What's coming is the greatest unrighteousness in David's life that he's going to commit against Bathsheba and against Uriah the Hittite. But that's not here yet. Right now, we're seeing David's righteousness, and as David is righteous, God blesses David. He is really fulfilling the Davidic Covenant. He's doing what is right, and as he's doing it, God is pouring blessing. In fact, in chapter 10, what we're going to see is that Ammon, and Aram are defeated. Sorry, Amnon is one of his sons. Ammon and Aram are defeated. What's the point of that? The point of that is that God is now, because of David's obedience, God is going to give him blessings in warfare as well. All this is coming to him because he's good. However, a day is coming when he's going to not be good, and then those blessings are going to stop and change. I hope this is helpful for you in understanding chapter 9, and if you have any questions, feel free to email anytime. You can also get on the website and check out the commentary. There's a lot more detail there. Thanks for watching.